Hi, I'm Meredith, and this is Nathan. And welcome to
Hi.
Artaholics Anonymous. I'll start by saying a few words about who we are, and then let's talk about what we're trying to do with this podcast. Nathan and I are both American Tolkien fans. We've been fans since we were very young. We're now both 23 years old.
Very young.
I was
Very young.
nine-ish.
I was
You beat me
7
by
or
2
8.
years. You.
My stepfather brought me The Hobbit to read as a bedtime story. And
No.
anyway, go on.
I'm from Indiana,
Yeah.
and he's from Massachusetts. I'm from Indianapolis.
I'm from I've moved around the Northeast a bit, but I was born in and currently live in a small post-industrial city called Greenfield on the Connecticut River.
I'm studying theatrical design and Spanish, and he is a master's student in theology and religion with a BA in Japanese. We've moved in some of the same online circles since about early 2013, and we've been close friends for about 2 years. We dated for a while, but it didn't really work out. But we're still I know it
Sad.
was sad, but we're still super close, and have a few other things we're collaborating on besides this podcast, which hopefully we will be able to talk about in some capacity.
I mean, the relevant to Tolkien's life and times. We're writing kind of like an Outlander meets Carol meets Sword of Honor World War II time travel romance type thing.
And I know we're
Um,
hoping to at least have Tolkien have a cameo at some point, so.
yeah, absolutely.
Both of us are Catholic converts. I converted from evangelical Protestantism and do not regret a single moment of that.
I was Episcopalian, and regret a couple things. I wasn't raised particularly religious.
I am bisexual, and one of the things that we're interested in as a result is LGBT issues both in general and as they relate to being Christian. I'm saying this because we're going to try not to be really discoursey, but faith and sexuality and all of that do kind of come up in Tolkien. So we might do some social issues episodes later on. If that's not your cup of tea, we will try to let you know so you can skip those.
Yeah, we'll try to like confine those to specific episodes on such and such a topic. We won't be doing like full bore critical theory, picking apart every aspect of Tolkien every episode.
Though I do reserve the right to go into a screaming fit about Thomas Jefferson anytime I'm reminded of anything about him. That's just, I reserve that right. You can't stop me.
Oh, I reserve the same right with Stanley Baldwin. Or for that matter, Shinzo Abe. Go on.
We will mostly be talking about Tolkien's Middle-earth legendarium, but we will be devoting some attention to his other work and to his life and times as well. So I think we should start out by talking about why we like Tolkien personally. You want to go first with that?
Sure. Tolkien was kind of my first induction into the world of fantasy after this weird period in early childhood that I spent basically only reading popular science books and encyclopedias. I was that kid. So, I was enthralled with The Hobbit as a bedtime story when I was like 7 or 8. I was interested in the fact that it was the first book I'd ever seen that I think that had a map of a fictional country other than Candyland. Other than Candyland, yes.
That was actually always my favorite part of Candyland. I was always so mad because the story of Candyland was so epic and grandiose, and the board game was so simple.
I think there's like some philosophy webcomic that uses Candyland as an illustration of determinism or something, because once you shuffle the cards, there's literally only one conceivable way the game can go.
That's kind of brilliant, actually. But
Anyway. So
before we get into the Candyland rabbit hole, let's get back on topic.
anyway, I I fell in love with the songs and the stories and the world and the whole concept of hobbits. I've always really had a deep spiritual affinity with. For reference, if somebody who has a deep spiritual affinity with cows and has a whole collection of cow kitchenware, so that's the kind of person I am.
I didn't know you had a collection of cow kitchenware.
Yeah, I started collecting it, and then one of my other best friends bought like 30 or 40 tickets at a county fair raffle to win this whole like set of cow kitchenware for me because I was already collecting it. Um, it was her Christmas present to my family one year. I fell in love with hobbits. Then I saw, read Lord of the Rings, saw the movies. It got me through a really lonely time in mid childhood after a move. And it just kind of colored my understanding of the world and fiction and life and what I wanted out of stories. And I'm not to proselytize. I'm sure this will come up again at some point. Not to proselytize right now, but it's probably a large part of why I eventually got religion. So I have that to thank you for. So that's my story.
My story is a little bit more roundabout. I was always kind of vaguely aware of The Hobbit, and like most people, I was aware of The Hobbit before I was aware of The Lord of the Rings. I actually was introduced to The Hobbit through the Rankin Bass animated special, which my father brought home from the library when I was, I think, 5.
Speaking of which, I'm so mad. I was gonna watch that on Kiss Cartoon, but then all the Kiss X sites went down.
I have it, so I'll just send it to you
Oh,
on
okay.
Dropbox or something.
Still, I think we should take a moment in observance of the Feast of the Martyrdom of KissAnime.to and her sisters.
I really don't know why it went away, but I'm...
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, to get back on something resembling the right topic.
Yeah.
It's... I don't really remember I didn't remember much of The Hobbit. I remembered Gollum rowing back and forth in his boat. And I remember Bard with his really deep voice talking to speaking to the Black Arrow. But that was all that I remembered of the Rankin Bass Hobbit. And then when I was 9, I actually
fun fact about the Rankin Bass Hobbit, by the way. Voice of the Elven King, I shit you not, Otto Preminger.
Are you serious?
Yes, I'm serious.
That explains why he's mysteriously German.
Yes, it's Otto Preminger. It's like a slightly emphasis on slightly higher brow version of Orson Welles' last role being Unicron in the Transformers movie.
Okay, I love Unicron, so don't talk to me about Unicron. I love Unicron, but it is still ridiculous. But anyway, I discovered Tolkien really through the Jackson films. Like, I think a lot of people of our generation did. We were kind of right on the cusp. Like, I'm almost certain that the people that are kids now are going to have seen the Lord of the Rings films before they read the books.
We were 8 when Fellowship came out, so, reasonable for us to have read The Hobbit by that point. Somewhat precocious on my part to have been already partway through Lord of the Rings.
I was aware of the Lord of the Rings. I actually, before I saw the Jackson films, my earliest memory of anything involving the Lord of the Rings specifically was I went over to spend the night at a friend's house in 3rd grade, and her older brother, who was in high school, was watching the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was a fight scene in Moria, because I remember asking what those were, and the answer was orcs, and I was very confused. But anyway, and I'm still confused when I look at Bakshi's orcs, but that's just because Bakshi in general confused. We'll talk about this eventually, but I have a lot of mixed feelings about his adaptation. Anyway, I saw the Jackson film. Well, I saw Fellowship, because that was the one that was out on DVD. My father had bought it, and it was a Saturday morning, and we watched it in 3 parts because it was a really long movie, and he didn't want me watching it by myself in case I got freaked out. Or in case there was something that he'd forgotten about that wasn't child-friendly.
Yeah, that was why my mom originally didn't want to let me see the Fellowship movie. Eventually I saw it at the end of the relevant school year with my late elementary school classroom. So
they showed you that? That's pretty awesome.
Well, I mean, it's why she was okay with it. Other kids, teachers, nothing too spooky, scary.
Well, I mean, I remember having nightmares about ring wraiths.
Mm-hmm.
That opens up a whole entirely different can of worms that I'm not going to touch on right now. But I saw Fellowship, and I had been rereading Redwall by Brian Jakes at the time, and
as one does.
And I put Redwall down, and I went over and I picked up Fellowship of the Ring off of my 4th grade class's little library area, and I remember being really frustrated because the Fellowship of the Ring, the film, is pretty concise and easy to follow if one is a precocious 9-year-old and has a knack for names. The Fellowship of the Ring, the book, takes 9 chapters to get anywhere, and I just had to like make myself keep reading it because I was like, I know there's cool stuff in this book because I've seen the movie. And it actually helped me to understand what was going on in the book and keep track of the characters, which is why I actually was the ass backwards Tolkien reader that became a purist but started out actually seeing the films first, which was a good idea when it came to Fellowship and Return of the King, but a bad idea when it came to Two Towers, because Two Towers as a theatrical film is a mess. And I still don't understand why they didn't release the extended edition as the actual cut of the film, because it makes so much more sense. So yeah, I actually saw the films before I read the books, like immediately before, because I was using them as a guide to help myself stay motivated when things got bogged down or we got stuck with Tom Bombadil for 3 chapters.
I feel like, one, don't knock Tom Bombadil. Two,
I love Tom Bombadil now, but 9-year-old me didn't like him at all.
that's fair. Two, I actually don't remember exactly what order I read and watched things in. I know I read Fellowship before I saw the Fellowship movie. I'm not sure what order the like Two Towers and Return of the King movies versus books came in. It was all roughly simultaneous for me.
I read Fellowship in about 3 months, which, considering that I was 9 and I was doing this completely on my own and not for a project or anything, was pretty decent. Like, I've known people that are adults that it takes them longer to read Fellowship. I read Two Towers over the course of a summer. The Two Towers took me forever to read. And I don't know why, because of the 3 books, it's actually the easiest to read, like, as a book. You're not meeting a bunch of different people or getting a lot of new information thrown at you. And, unlike both Return of the King and Fellowship, if you're 9 and you're me and what you're interested in are, like, the cool journey scenes and the fights, there are a lot of cool journey scenes and fights in Two Towers, so I don't know why it took me the longest to read. But I do remember reading Return of the King in, like, less than a day. I was driving back from Oklahoma, my family, and that's like a 16-hour drive, and I had borrowed Return of the King from my uncle, who was not reading it currently and had really no interest in it. So I borrowed it and I read it on this trip back. The actual narrative part of the story I got through in maybe like 13 hours. I did nothing but read. I haven't actually pulled off a feat like that since, so I guess kudos to Return of the King for that. But I don't know. So I've been a Tolkien fan since I was about 9. I've been in the fandom-ish since then. Of course, being like a young-ish kid and then an early adolescent, my exposure to internet Tolkien fandom was pretty limited because my internet exposure was pretty limited. My parents didn't like me talking to strangers on the internet, and because I was a good child and didn't break a lot of rules, I only talked to a couple of strangers on the internet. So I was kind of in the fandom, but not really. And then when I got into adolescence, I started reaching out and meeting more people, but I didn't actually really become involved as like a creator of fan works, etc., until early years in college when I discovered that I wasn't alone and there was actually like a Silmarillion / History of Middle-earth fandom.
Should we just like elide the part where we become Silmarillion and History of Middle-earth trash for now? Because I feel like that's a story in itself.
Oh, it's absolutely a story in itself. I mean, I think for me at least, the short version was, as soon as I finished The Lord of the Rings when I was 10, I decided I wanted to read the Silmarillion. That did not go well. I got as far as like halfway through the Valaclenta, and I was like, no, I can't do this. Nope, done. And then I read various pieces of the history of Middle-earth, like the books of Lost Tales, that were a little bit easier for smaller minds, I guess.
Yeah. I had the Book of Lost Tales not assigned to me, but like casually semi-assigned to me by I think my 5th grade homeroom teacher, Mr. James.
I did a book report on the Book of Lost Tales in 6th grade. We got to pick a book, any book, to do a report on, and that was mine. After my adventures with the Book of Lost Tales, I kind of just let it lie for a little bit. I had other fandoms and other things that were taking up my time in high school, and so while I was kind of active in the Tolkien fandom, it wasn't really a thing. And then when I started college, I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to reread the Silmarillion, because I read it all the way through again when I was 12. I made myself do that. And I remembered some pieces of it, but not really. And then I reread it and I was like, holy shit, this is beautiful. That's my 5 minute, without including any frills at all, version of the story.
Well, it was longer than 5 minutes, mostly because I kept interjecting because I'm a bit of an interruptosaurus.
It's okay.
So yeah, that's how each of us got into Tolkien. You wanted to discuss the question of whether fantasy as a genre is Tolkien's own invention, or if Tolkien is working within a pre-established fantasy, especially English language fantasy tradition.
I think what I'm talking about with like Tolkien as the creator of modern fantasy, I think he is, but I also think that he did draw from a lot of sources that people don't like to talk about particularly, which has always confused me because when you go back, you see Tolkien in other places. There's
What? Oh, can I? No, you given it? Did you have an example you wanted to give?
if you have one, you can go first.
I do. Okay, so I'm currently working my way through a reread of At the Back of the North Wind by George MacDonald, which I hadn't read in a long time and I'd forgotten most of. And so At the Back of the North Wind is a high Victorian children's fantasy novel by George MacDonald, who's an acknowledged influence on both Tolkien and Lewis. In The Great Divorce, MacDonald has the role that Virgil has in the Divine Comedy, for example.
Which I think is beautiful, and I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah. MacDonald was a Congregationalist pastor, among other things, and At the Back of the North Wind is his story about God using the pain and suffering of the world to create good things and to create beauty. It's not flawless theologically, but it's in general, I think, a valiant effort at justifying the ways of God to man, as as Milton would put it. But the middle of the book, you've read Northwind, right?
I have. I'm looking at it on my shelf right now, actually.
The middle of the book drags abominably.
Oh, Lord. When I was a child, I had such a hard time getting through that book because when you get about a third of the way in, it just stops.
I mean, Northwind disappears, and Northwind, the character, disappears. It's like where is my lovely Victorian elemental death spirit GLaDOS? I miss her.
And she disappears, and then Diamond meets that girl whose name I can never remember because that's how memorable she is.
Her name is Nanny, which there's all sorts of Freudian implications there.
Her name is Nanny, and they have these weird, like, very Victorian children's book adventures, like going to the seaside and other things.
You're forgetting the order of events a little, but it's okay. The events aren't very memorable, but there's this one chapter 28, Little Daylight. Do you remember this?
Oh, Lord! I forgot about this chapter. You remembered this and you brought it up, so you get to tell our listeners about it.
Long, the grass was green.
You're the one who brought this up, so you get to tell our listeners about this chapter.
There is a chapter in At the Back of the North Wind where one of the supporting characters tells a group of children in a Victorian children's street hospital a fairy tale of his own invention, which has a bizarre... It's like a bridge between Sleeping Beauty and Baron and Luthien. It's ridiculous. This princess is cursed to only be awake at night and to wax and wane with the moon, and this wandering prince who's been forced out of his country by a revolution against the nobility, George MacDonald trying to be #topical or whatever. He's been forced out of his in consequence of the wickedness of the nobles, an insurrection took place upon the death of the old king. The greater part of the nobility was massacred, and the young prince was compelled to flee for his life. So, ripped from the headlines in the 19th century.
Hopefully you filed those serial numbers off, George. I could still
speaking
kind
of
of make them out.
speaking of filing serial numbers off, um, so the prince goes. He wandered. I mean, just listen to this. After walking a considerable distance, he thought he was coming to the outside of the forest. But when he reached what he thought the last of it, he found himself only upon the edge of a great open space in it covered with grass. The moon shone very bright, and he thought he had never seen a more lovely spot. Still, it looked dreary because of its loneliness, blah blah blah. All at once he spied something in the middle of the grass. What could it be? It moved, it came nearer. Was it a human creature gliding across, a girl dressed in white gleaming in the moonshine? She came nearer and nearer. He crept behind a tree and watched, wondering. It must be some strange being of the wood, a nymph whom the moonlight and the warm dusky air had enticed from her tree. But when she But when she came close to where he stood, he no longer doubted she was human, for he had caught sight of her sunny hair and her clear blue eyes and the loveliest face and form that he had ever seen. All at once, she began singing like a nightingale and dancing to her own music with her eyes ever turned towards the moon. It goes on.
I had forgotten entirely that that was a thing until you mentioned it, and wow. Like, I know that
I mean, she's a blue-eyed blonde, but considering Luthien only looks like what she looks like because that's what Edith Tolkien looks like.
considering that like half the cast of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion only look like what they look like because that's what Edith Tolkien looked like. Like there's a serious dearth of blondes in that book, and it's probably because of her.
The man had a type.
He did have a type. It was a type that apparently extended to apostates and kinslayers as well as manic pixie nightmare goddesses. But no, you're absolutely right. That's a really good example and way better than the one that I was gonna bring up. So
Well, tell me what one were you going to bring up?
I was actually going to talk a little bit about John Carter and H. Rider Haggard and all of those weird Edwardian adventure stories.
Oh no, please do so. Please talk about them.
I mean, first off, like, I haven't read She in ages, but I did read King Solomon's Mines pretty recently because I got bored. So I remember Haggard ish, but basically the plot of She is that this group of adventurers, kind of multicultural Europeans with a couple of native Africans, go into darkest Africa.
As is the Hagrid way.
As is the Haggard way. They go into stereotypical darkest Africa and they have some adventures,
As is the Hagrid way.
and they run into this like weird as shit civilization with the leader being this very Galadriel-esque figure who goes by She Who Must Be Obeyed, and she's like tall, pale, blonde woman who is immortal and is immortal thanks to this weird waterfall thing. And there's a convoluted and bizarre romance between Alan. I don't think it's Alan Quartermain, but I can't remember. I think it might actually be Alan Quartermain because
It's not Alan Quartermain.
it's not. He
It's
had
not
like three main characters though, so I can't blame myself for forgetting. And they're all basically the same person.
Alan Quartermain doesn't show up in She. Alan Quartermain shows up in this later novel that Haggard wrote as a cash cow tie-in crossover.
That's a good point. I'd forgotten that he wrote it as a cash cow try and crossover, but I still stand in saying that all of H. Rider Haggard's male heroes are basically the same character and could all be called by the same name.
Yes, very much so.
That's why I call it. That's why
Unlike Tolkien's heroes.
Yeah, the interesting thing that I would argue there's some thematic roots here at least because it's got a lot of the same goings on as some of the more episodic parts of the Lord of the Rings specifically. This sense of all these people from all these different places are coming together with a goal in mind, but the really interesting thing, at least at first, isn't necessarily achieving that goal. It's all of the cool things that you get to do along the way, and you meet a super powerful blonde sorceress who either loves you or hates you, and I don't know, it's interesting. Though, I would argue almost that, and I actually don't know if Tolkien was familiar with Edgar Rice Burroughs' work at all, But I would argue that there are more roots to Tolkien in John Carter than H. Rider Haggard, and I've seen more people talk about Haggard than I have about Burroughs and Carter, and so I want to touch on that for a little bit. Like,
I feel like I vaguely remember Tolkien saying something about Burroughs in his letters, but my copy of the letters is upstairs and I'm too lazy to go get it right now.
it's interesting because more people remember Edgar Rice Burroughs for writing Tarzan, but Tarzan, at least for me, is not his seminal work of fiction. Mostly because I think that all the really interesting things that Burroughs does come out in John Carter, um, which is the Mars series. The basic premise of the Mars series is that this guy named John Carter, who probably isn't human, is magically transported to Mars. They call it Barsoom. It's this dead desert world, and it gives you this kind of like the best term of for the aesthetic that I can think of is like Tatooine Gothic, because there's all these ruined cities, and you get the sense that this was really once a great and vibrant planet, but now everything is falling into decay. And John Carter goes to Mars and finds out that because he's from Earth, where the gravity is higher, he can move faster and jump higher and is much more physically imposing than quite a lot of these Martians. And he winds up going around and making all of these people be friends with one another. He's captured by some groups of Martians because there are multiple different types of Martians. And there's green Martians, which are literally green, and red Martians, which are literally red. Like, all of these people are primary colored. So you get a couple of moments of, is he trying to make a weird racist description? But no, they're literally referring to primary colors. Like, red Martians are the color of the walls of my room.
It's especially weird since John Carter is from this like Virginia Confederate aristocratic family. So
Yeah, he's from he calls himself a fighting man of Virginia, though I do actually hold that he's probably not human because he doesn't know how old he is. He has no idea how old he is. All he can ever remember is being an adult, being about 6'8", with dark hair and gray eyes. He doesn't know how
oh, for
long
God's sake!
he's not. He doesn't know how long he's been a tall man with dark hair and gray eyes. Nor does he actually have any grasp of like how long he's been alive. He calls himself a fighting man of Virginia and says he's got family in Virginia, but nothing in his actual like description of himself gives me any sense of being connected to these people. Other than Burroughs, who is here playing the nephew slash literary agent, who says that he keeps meeting his immortal uncle John Carter, who is able to who eventually is able to astral project himself back and forth from Mars at will. But the interesting thing about John Carter is that unlike, for example, Tarzan or any of H. Rider Haggard's heroes, John Carter has a lot of feelings. He's almost more Tolkienian in the sense that like he actually goes on this mini monologue addressed to us, the readers, in the second book because he is writing all of this down, and this is Burroughs, his nephew, having found his notes about how he doesn't think that it's shameful for a man to cry or to have close emotional bonds or to want to do what's right and be a good person because that's just the decent thing to do, you guys. There's so much depth to this, and and I really do actually want to know if Tolkien read John Carter and what Tolkien thought of John Carter, because there are a lot of ties in between the two, not least of which is the fact that John Carter is probably an elf named Maglor, but nobody is keeping score here.
There's
Side note, if Maglor did wind up astral projecting himself to Mars and then marrying a super hot alien princess in like the year 1860, I'd be super okay with that.
Are you more or less done talking about this like Haggard Burroughs thing for now? Because there was something else I was going to bring
No,
up.
I'm absolutely done. Please change the subject.
Okay. There's also Tolkien's kind of pissy, not quite imitation, not quite rejection of the works of Shakespeare, particularly his lifelong belief that he could improve on Macbeth.
To be completely fair,
he could improve on Macbeth.
Yes. Like fuck Macbeth. I too have
like maybe King Lear or Hamlet he could not have improved on, but Macbeth, Othello even, absolutely.
I would actually be really interested to have seen Tolkien's take on Othello.
I I mean, it would depend on the point in Tolkien's career because
Okay, like Smith.
I think both of us are of the begins with pretty intense latent racism, moves to conscious rejection of racism later on, school of race and Tolkien criticism.
And I will preface this by saying both of us are
Are
white.
white, yes.
So our opinions on Tolkien and race are not nearly as important as the opinions of Tolkien and race that fans who are of color have contributed to the conversation. But my at least understanding of Tolkien is that there is a lot of latent racism and assorted bullshit from the era that he grew up in that he did kind of consciously absorb and propagate at first. And then I think as he got older, you can see a more nuanced and more complicated opinion on things and a rejection of some of his earlier biases and stereotypes.
Which is about as good as can be expected, I think, considering he was literally a white South African.
A white South African who, upon his return to England, didn't spend a lot of time in very diverse circles.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And but I don't want to. I want to save like the Tolkien and race conversation for a time when hopefully we have somebody who isn't white who can contribute some thoughts to this.
Yeah, I would certainly hope so, yeah.
Because I don't think that either of us are particularly qualified to address it. But I'm glad that you brought up that both of us are kind of the opinion that Tolkien got better with age.
In this particular respect, yeah.
There are others that I have some issues with him on, but anyway, you're right about the Macbeth thing. I kind of think it's hilarious and wonderful that so much of the Lord of the Rings, in particular, is basically a giant screw you to Macbeth.
Um, for the unaware, the two big screw yous to Macbeth in Lord of the Rings are the Ents March on Isengard, which was based on Tolkien feeling cheated that the Great Burnham Wood coming to Dunsinane Hill prophecy didn't actually involve ambulatory trees, and Eowyn and Merry killing the Witch King, which is based on Tolkien feeling cheated by the whole shocking Macduff was born via C-section twist to resolve the no man of woman born prophecy.
Both of which I think are completely legitimate reasons to be mad at Shakespeare. For what it's worth, I was mad at Shakespeare for those exact same reasons. To get back on topic, though, Tolkien, I think, too, even like looking at the tropes that he plays with, which of course were very English tropes. The idea of the returning king, the idea of like the pastoral or the great capital R romantic story where you go off and you discover secrets about yourself, blah 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 blah. He plays with all these very English tropes and a lot of things that Shakespeare does, at least in some capacity, address. But he seems really reluctant to go full like, oh yeah, I love Shakespeare. Shakespeare's great. And I haven't read his letters in ages, so I don't actually remember if he had any particular opinions about the Bard. But no, it's in. But you're right that it's interesting that he seems to be ambivalent towards Shakespeare in general and Macbeth specifically. But then again, Macbeth is a play that it is really easy to improve upon. So.
There is this one letter where Tolkien talks about how irritated he gets that people talk about Chaucer as like the furthest back English literature goes, and how Chaucer isn't the young days of English literature. Chaucer is middle-aged English literature, and looking at English literature in real context, starts with like Cynewulf and Beowulf and the inscriptions on those migration period hordes they found, and Chaucer is like somewhere around the midpoint. So I think Tolkien may be reacting against Shakespeare partially as the symbolic father of modern English literature as such.
That actually makes a weird
emphasis on modern.
Like Tolkien is bitter about Tolkien. I think is bitter about more people not liking Beowulf. I think Tolkien is bitter about that specifically. Like, I mean, to be like his first, the thing odds are, if you haven't read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, but you've heard Tolkien's name bandied about in like English scholarly circles. It's because they've been talking about Beowulf, the monsters, and the critics, um, which was even referenced in my like super basic regular 12th grade English textbook.
Mm-hmm.
So, which was basically a massive rebuttal to a current scholarly trend of seeing the monsters in Beowulf as metaphorical or some like aspect of the human condition. He made the successful argument that the monsters in Beowulf have to be perceived as actual monsters in order for the story to make any sense or have any real meaning.
The trend that if I remember correctly, the trend that he was arguing against in general was this like Whiggish or vulgar Marxist reading of Beowulf as only useful insofar as it can be strip mined for tangential information about like the economics and culture of Anglo-Saxon England.
That was part of it. The other part,
People weren't understanding it as a story as such.
and I think, but I do also remember him bitching a little bit about the fact that people were trying to argue that the monsters were metaphorical. But no, which like, okay, real talk, Ronald. We have to chat about this. I really don't like Beowulf. I've never liked Beowulf. I've thought that Beowulf was a Mary Sue from the first moment that I saw him. I only started caring about Beowulf when I realized that he was going to die and he had to make decisions that were heroic knowing that he was going to fail. Because up until then, he'd seemed to me like this really muscular dude bro who was so confident in his own strength that he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll fight this monster that's killed like 6 people naked all by myself. I got this." And I know that that's not the point of Beowulf, but that's the impression that I get from Beowulf from every translation that I've ever read of Beowulf. So maybe you should have translated all of Beowulf so I could read that translation instead of the terrible ones that I have now that make him look like an ass. And that is my rant on Beowulf. I'm sorry.
Did you ever know that you're my hero?
I'm sorry, like it's super unpopular to say, but he's a dick.
I agree. I totally agree. I read this in high school English. I read this like modernized telling of Beowulf that has actual character motivations and like gives some female character something to do, other than Grendel's mother. Um, and I was so disappointed when I read the actual Beowulf, and nobody seemed to have any motivations or inner life. Like, maybe that's just my tastes being too modern. Maybe Tolkien would just say I've been ruined by the modern overly psychological literature of Tolkien and the Romantics.
But I don't actually agree with that because his own personal retelling of the legend of Sigurd and Guthrun, which I have read, which was his poetry, which is what his own poetic adaptation of some stories from the Edda, coupled with a very long lecture that he gave about how the Edda is actually a misnomer and Germanic and Scandinavian stories, blah 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 blah. Which is a wonderful read. But anyway, like, he's fascinated by the inner lives of these characters and their psychological motivations, and he keeps trying to figure out how they work. Like, even in this very supposed to be an attempt to tie together all of the disparate threads of this one particular story in the saga of the Volsungs, like, there's a bunch of psychological things that go on. He's fascinated by Guthrun and her, like, struggling with things and her issues and her betrayals and all of this stuff going on. Like, it's really frustrating because even when he's trying to be old, he still manages to create compelling characters with motivations. And the only motivation that I got out of Beowulf was that Hrothgar was secretly gay for Beowulf. The one last thing that I do actually want to touch on briefly is kind of where things are going from here. And the reason that I say that is because you've got so many people who are now aware that the Tolkien ripoff is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And who are trying to do things that are not Tolkien ripoffs. And sometimes I think that that's done out of spite. Cough, cough, China Mieville, cough. And sometimes I think that that's done out of a genuine desire to be like, look, this was great, this was awesome, but we could do more than that.
Susanna Clark.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
part of the reason why I wanted to discuss at least some of the possible sources for some of Tolkien's thoughts or his contemporaries, and the roots of this is because there are other places that we can go with those same roots. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a ton of Tolkien ripoffs. I mean, again, other than Star Wars and to an extent Harry Potter, which is more post Lewis than post Tolkien. There's not really much being done in terms of like trying to sincerely, constructively, respectfully build on Tolkien's legacy.
I think that the attempts, like, the best attempts that I've seen to build on Tolkien's legacy have generally come from fan fiction. Like, and I mean specifically canonical gap filler stuff like the Tempered Steel, which I'm gonna take like 30 seconds to gush about the Tempered Steel.
Hold on, is the Tempered Steel the one about the colossally long series of fics about the Gondorian surgeon?
No, that's not the Tempered Steel. Though the Tempered Steel is a fic on the Silmarillion Writers Guild website, which is gap filler about it's a novelization of the events from Maethros' capture to shortly after the Merith Atherthad, which is the Feast of Reuniting. It's thousands and thousands of words. It explores the perspectives of the political scene in Lake Mithrim from both the Fëanorian and the Nola Finwayan sides. It deals with Maethros' rescue and his rehabilitation, and the title, of course, is referring to him because he is the Tempered Steel. But
would you recommend I read it?
It's amazing, actually. It's very good. If you don't ship Rusingon, there's nothing in here that will be like, oh, gross, ew, it's my no TP. If you do ship Rusingon, you'll be happy regardless, because there are some little nods in that direction that make me think the author does ship it. But anyway, it's really well written to the point that I actually kind of think that it should be paired with the Silmarillion. Like, I don't normally say this about fanfics. This is good enough to be included in the original text. It's incredible. It drags a little bit after Maethros is reunited with his brothers, but it's incredible and really well written, and one of the more respectful ways that I've seen of building on Tolkien's legacy, which is examining his works as myth and fleshing them out and adding more things.
I can't think of anything that I published that I'd say is really building constructively and respectfully on Tolkien, actually. Like you said, the closest probably is Star Wars, and Star Wars is at least as much post-Frank Herbert as anything else.
I actually don't want to call it post-Frank Herbert, though, because... And here's why. I mean, it is kind of post-Frank Herbert, but, like... Star Wars is the heir of Tolkien, because Star Wars didn't start off as science fiction, really. Star Wars started off as George Lucas wanting to play around with archetype and myth.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he talked to Joseph fucking Campbell about that, but you know, we can't all always get what we want.
Yeah.
He wanted to play around with archetype and myth, and he did research about how archetypes work and how myths work and the things that are culturally resonant to people. And he came to a lot of the same conclusions that Tolkien did. And we know that he was at least in part inspired by Tolkien, but he managed to take that inspiration and channel it into a more thematic way of looking at events. Like, I do genuinely believe that eucatastrophe is only used properly in Star Wars post-Tolkien. People like to toy around with it. You see it referenced a lot, especially in, like, the middle wave of Marvel movies. There's a lot of flying things coming from the sky and portals that need to be closed and right on the edge of it being too late. But Star Wars is the only one who uses that with any kind of deftness or grace. Or any kind of sense of the spirituality of it all.
I think that's kind of a good place to leave off this particular discussion.
I think so, and
would you like to spend a few minutes just debriefing and discussing where this podcast will go next?
I think that's actually an excellent idea. This, and I'll let all of you listening know, we're kind of spitballing ideas right now. We have a Tumblr. I will be linking to it in the show notes. If you are interested at all in sending us ideas for episodes, or if you have questions, comments, whatever, let us know through that Tumblr, and there'll also be an email address and all of that. But, so yeah, this is just some ideas that we have, so if you hate them, please let us know before we start recording.
If you love them, please let us know after we record.
Yes. But I know that we've talked enough about fan fiction even this episode that we're going to have to discuss fan works at some point. And I don't know if we want to do lots of episodes, or I don't know if we want to do lots of episodes on fan works, or if we want to just do one and have that be like the thing that we do. I also want to do a period of maybe about 3 months where we talk about all the various adaptations of Tolkien.
Do you maybe want to do a review of the Beren and Luthien book when it comes out?
Oh yes, I absolutely want to do a review of the Beren and Luthien book when it comes out.
I also, one thing I'd be really interested in doing would be some, Tolkien's Life and Times type stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I think that we should maybe aim for once every 2 months talking about, like, Tolkien or his life or his times.
Yeah, like the Tolkien family in World War II. Tolkien and Alan Turing, ships passing in the night, things like that.
Tolkien as World War I writer.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
Tolkien and Edith, a love story for our time. Speaking of which, just throwing out a comment about this. One reason I've always been a little leery of the idea that the changes of the 20th century were so enormous and cataclysmic and faster than ever before, and why I've been always focused a little more on like the changes of the Victorian era, is because if you read about Ronald and Edith's love story, you can imagine yourself inhabiting the same world as these crazy kids way more easily than you can imagine them inhabiting the same world as, like, Napoleon. I think so, anyway. Even though the time period separations are about the same.
No, I'm actually with you on that. So...
Anyway, that's just an observation.
And then I do want to also talk about, like, other things that have sprung from Tolkien music and stage shows.
Like Lord of the Rings musical, yeah.
And the wonderful, amazing thing that is the Russian fan community and its utter lack of giving a shit.
Do we have to talk about the Black Book of Arda?
At some point we have to talk about the Black Book of Arda, though I want to see if I can get a Russian fan who speaks English to actually talk with us about this. Because...
that would be a lot of fun. Assuming they weren't, like, too much of an edgelord atheist.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of people that I know that are Russian fans, or that speak Russian, who might be willing to talk to me about it, that aren't too much of an edgelord atheist, but, like, specifically I was referring to Finished1. Which, do you know about Finished1? If you don't know about Finished1, we're going to watch Finished1 at some point.
I don't know about it, so I guess we're gonna watch it at some point. Is it one of these, like, Russian fan films?
I will tell you, Finished1 is a Russian rock opera.
Oh.
By the group Temple, which is an adaptation of Beren and Luthien.
Good. A Finrod-focused one, from the sounds of it.
Not actually, no. I think it's just called Finished1 because one of the big set pieces is Finrod and Sauron's song battle.
Which is as it should be.
So, basically, that's kind of an overview of where we're going. We'll probably start to sound more professional once we get a little bit more focused.
Yeah, we're just having fun with the concept of doing a Tolkien podcast together right now.
So anyway, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. Have a good night.
Night.